Lisbon had been a city that expected the world to look at it. Then, on November 1st, 1755, that confidence cracked in a single morning. Within hours, one man would rewrite Lisbon's future with a single practical order. All Saints' Day began with candlelight and worshippers, and then the ground shook hard enough to upend routines across the capital. A short time later, the waterfront became uncertain. Fires spread where lamps and candles had fallen. I covered the disaster itself in the earlier videos in this series, so today we stay with what followed. If you missed those episodes, start there, then come back for the rebuild. I'm Arthur Hale, and I'll be your guide. This video is an AI-generated historical reconstruction for education based on historical records and reputable research, with full references in the description. Where records are incomplete, a few details are reconstructed to support learning and viewer experience. Listen for the moment emergency becomes permission and someone turns rescue into rule. In the first hours after the shocks, Lisbon's crisis was not theory. It was food, shelter, security, and coordination. Streets were damaged, routes were unreliable, rumors traveled faster than official orders. In moments like that, power does not belong to the person with the most impressive title. It belongs to whoever can make daily life hold together. That is where Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo stepped forward, the man history would remember as the Marquês de Pombal. His most famous instruction from the aftermath was blunt and practical. We bury the dead and feed the living. Whatever the exact phrasing, the meaning was clear. Stop spiraling. Start organizing. With that sentence, he framed the catastrophe as an administrative problem. And once a disaster becomes an administrative problem, the person running administration becomes the center of gravity. Pombal moved fast. He imposed strict controls, coordinated relief, and pushed planning forward while the city was still in shock. The normal rhythm of government could not compete with the urgency of survival. His decisiveness filled a vacuum. And when a vacuum is filled quickly, it starts to feel like it was meant to be filled that way. But that sentence wasn't only about relief, it was about who would rule next. Before 1755, Lisbon's authority had been visible in stone and ritual. The Pacho da Ribeira, the royal palace facing the Tagus, symbolized the crown's command over empire and trade. After 1755, symbols mattered less than systems. Pombal understood that if he could rebuild the city, he could also rebuild the state's expectations of power. So he made a decision that refused nostalgia. Lisbon would not be patched, it would be redesigned. Central Lisbon had grown over centuries with narrow alleys and dense medieval patterns. Pombal replaced that maze with wide, straight, perpendicular streets. A grid. The reason was practical and immediate. Wider avenues improved air circulation and sanitation, and they served as fire breaks, making it harder for flames to race from block to block. But the effect was also political. A grid is legible. It's organized. It signals that someone has the authority to impose order on daily life. The clearest symbol of that shift rose where the old world had stood most proudly. On the site of the destroyed royal palace, Pombal built the Praça do Comércio, the Square of Commerce. Its grand U-shaped space opened toward the Tagus like a gateway. The location and the name delivered the message. The city's center would now be framed around administration and trade rather than a royal balcony. Most people noticed the straight streets first, but Pombal's most important innovation was hidden inside the walls. Rebuilding after an earthquake forces a question every builder hates and every citizen needs answered. What stops this from happening again? The reconstruction's most ingenious technique was the Gaiola Pombalina, the Pombaline cage. Builders integrated an internal timber lattice into masonry walls, reinforced with cross bracing. Instead of depending on rigid stone alone, the buildings gained a flexible skeleton designed to absorb and distribute force, better to bend than to break. Pombal also pushed for standardization and prefabrication. Instead of improvising every facade and frame, components could be produced to set dimensions, repeated across blocks, and assembled more quickly on site. The Baixa became a coordinated build, not a chaotic patchwork. A city center rebuild that felt closer to a system than a collection of one-off projects. There is even a famous story that captures the spirit of this engineering mindset. Models were built and vibrations were simulated by having troops march around them. Whether every detail of that testing story holds up perfectly or not, it reflects the era's new confidence in practical experimentation. Would you accept stricter control if it made your city safer? Comment your choice. By the early years of rebuilding, Pombal had done something rare. He had turned a disaster response into a permanent blueprint. The city's design now carried his logic: speed, clarity, repeatable standards, and authority centralized enough to enforce them. But architecture was only one half of his project. A reconstruction of this scale requires power over land, labor, regulation, and money. It also requires the ability to silence the voices that demand exceptions. That meant Pombal's system would inevitably collide with older power centers, especially the high nobility and the church. The collision became unmistakable in 1758. That year, there was an attempted assassination of King Jose I. The king survived, but the event triggered a sweeping investigation and a political storm that Pombal used to reshape the balance of power. The aftermath became known as the Tavora affair. The Tavora family belonged to the highest layers of Portuguese nobility. Accused of involvement, they were arrested, condemned, their estates seized, and in 1759, members of the family and others were publicly executed. What matters here is not only the horror of the event, but the clarity of its outcome. The old aristocracy received a message. Resistance could be broken, rival influence could be erased, and the state that emerged from the crisis would not be one where old families could casually veto the future. In Pombal's Lisbon, the stones were straight, but the politics were bloodier than ever. Historians have long debated aspects of the case, including questions about evidence and the political advantages the affair brought to Pombal. But the consequences are not in doubt. The traditional nobility was weakened, and Pombal's authority grew sharper. Then he moved against another independent power center. In 1759, Pombal expelled the Jesuits from Portugal and its dominions. The Jesuits held enormous influence through education and networks across the empire. Pombal viewed them as a barrier to the kind of centralized state he wanted, and he accused them of dangerous interference. Their institutions were shut down, their property sequestered, and their presence removed in one sweeping action. Again, whatever mixture of motives sat behind the move, the result was straightforward. A powerful rival institution was stripped of influence, and the state gained assets and space to pursue its rebuilding agenda without interference. If you want to understand Pombal's reputation, this is the core of it. He did not only rebuild Lisbon, he cleared the political ground around it. And now the earlier question turns into a sharper one. Was the new order simply about safety and progress, or was safety and progress the language that justified control? The rebuilt Baixa can be admired on practical terms. Wider streets reduced risk. A rational plan improved movement and sanitation. The Pombalina cage introduced an early form of seismic resilience. The standardized rebuild accelerated recovery and created a coherent district rather than a fragmented one. But a city built on straight lines also makes authority more mobile. It makes neighborhoods more visible. It makes enforcement easier. The same design features that help a city function can also help a state govern with a firmer hand. That duality is why Pombal's legacy remains unresolved. He was an Enlightenment reformer in method and a hard autocrat in execution. He believed in planning, engineering, and systems. He also believed in removing opponents decisively. These are not two separate stories. They are one story, told from different angles. In the years that followed, Lisbon's rebuilt core stood as a daily reminder of what had changed. The Praça do Comércio opened toward the Tagus as a civic statement. The Baixa grid guided crowds and commerce through ordered space. The Pombalina cage, hidden inside walls, carried a quiet promise that buildings could endure more than they once could. Lisbon's resurrection became an international reference point for disaster recovery and urban resilience. But inside Portugal, it also became the monument to a political reality. The state had become more centralized, more disciplined, and harder to challenge. Pombal's genius was not simply that he had answers, it was that he made his answers permanent. A grid where a maze had been, a square of commerce where a palace had stood, a flexible cage inside walls that once relied only on brittle stone. Lisbon rose again, not as a replica of the old city, but as an argument for a new kind of strength, planned, standardized, engineered, and enforced. If you want the next chapter, subscribe and tell me which choice you made.